Thank you. Let me extend my greetings to you, Mr. Qureshi, the panelist colleagues, Dr. Bahar Jalali, and Ms. Sarah Wahidi, and all those who watch us through this webinar. Also, let me thank the European Foundation for South Asian Studies for organizing this timely side event during the 49th session of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. On a rather increasingly important topic, human rights situation in Afghanistan. Today, or as far as I'm concerned tonight, perhaps, the focus of my presentation is not too much on what the Taliban do, but what the non-Taliban do at national, regional, and international levels to stop or at least reduce the rapidly growing violations of human rights in Afghanistan. We've seen enough of how the Taliban have been challenging the international humanitarian and human rights laws in the past 28 years, in the form of their war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Nowadays, every day, and sometimes every few hours perhaps, we read news headlines about the restrictions that the Taliban have imposed on people's basic human rights and how things are going from bad to worse. After 7 months of playing hide and seek in the hope of receiving international recognition, and while the world is watching Ukraine, the Taliban have recently unleashed a new wave of restrictions on the human rights of our 40 million population. Generally, we've seen arbitrary arrests of journalists, civil society activists, former government officials, and those who dissent. Also, we've seen door-to-door house searches without warrants. A range of restrictions have been imposed on the rights of women and girls. They include closure of girls' high schools, denying women the rights to work in different sectors. Women aren't allowed to fly without male chaperone. Enforcing a specific attire on women. Women traveling alone cannot have intercity road trips. We've seen segregation of men and women, especially in public places such as parks. Also, they've been restricting the rights of men too. All government employees need to have beards now and wear traditional clothes. All men are forced to pray at their local mosques. We have seen reprisals, summary executions of former officials and security forces personnel. They have banned art and music and have been punishing artists and destroying art accessories and musical instruments. On freedom of expression, they have banned foreign media outlets like BBC, Voice of America, Deutsche Welle, and have issued restrictive guidelines for our own local media. According to some media reports, quoting unnamed security sources, the Taliban, in addition to existing suicide brigade structures that they have put together recently, have started recruiting hundreds of orphans of those who have been killed in fighting the Taliban in the past 20 years and have placed them in training centers in order to be added to the suicide brigades. Given this, and what they do with the education system, within a few years, Afghanistan is likely to be the hotbed of terror. There is a lot more that I might remember later, but think about the impact of all these violations on the security and economy of the country. What is the rationale for all of this? What's the explanation of the Taliban? On the surface, they call these restrictions Islamic. Deep down, most of what they do is against the basic teachings of Islam, with no reference in the Quran or Hadith. If anything in the Quran or Hadith, it is in support of respect for human rights. A good number of these restrictions originate from the tribal village life that they want to forcefully impose on the entire country. Another factor is the upbringing of most Taliban members in the Pakistani madrasas with specific curriculum for strategic purposes. So that's enough said about the Taliban and what they do. What are the non-Taliban people doing about it? At national level, our people have been expressing their political, civil, and combat opposition. Most of our ordinary people have been terrified, tired, and exhausted, looking for an opportunity to leave the country if they could. 60% of our people are in need of basic humanitarian assistance. Majority of our politicians, academics, diplomats, young talents, wherever they may be and using whatever opportunities they have at their disposal, have become outspoken against the Taliban. Civil activists, in particular women and girls and youth activists, have been in the front line of daily protest under extreme conditions. The continuous aggression of the Taliban has forced people in different parts of the country to organize armed resistance as well. Some conservative tribal circles, believers of ethnopolitics, vicious foreign circles, and crime syndicates, as well as those who suffered under the violation of human rights by international forces in the past 20 years, they have got some sympathy for what the Taliban are doing, and they turn a blind eye to the violation of human rights by the Taliban. At regional level, or rather specifically at the neighboring countries level, due to the proximity, bilateral relations, domestic policies, and realpolitik, they have mixed reactions. Some have been heavily engaged with the Taliban, some have had limited engagement, and some have had some rare contacts with the Taliban. Generally, they have been very conservative in their criticism of the Taliban, violation of human rights, in the case of some, perhaps because they themselves don't have a good record of human rights, especially dealing with dissent. Pakistan, which has been nurturing and using the Taliban as its proxy in pursuit of strategic objectives, is not only completely silent, but rather calls the Taliban victory as breaking shackles of slavery. As we speak here today, the foreign ministers of Afghanistan's 6 neighbors have gathered in the city of Tangxi of China for a conference of today and tomorrow on Afghanistan. Russian, Indonesian, and Qatar foreign ministers are also invited. On the margins of the conference, they will all have a dialogue session with the Taliban representative. Of course, it would have been nice and it would have been good to see the opponents of the Taliban too at this conference, but we don't. But we hope a clear and unified message is given to the Taliban to give up with their restrictions and work with the rest of the people of Afghanistan for a truly just and representative governance system. At international level, beyond our region, which is more relevant to the work of the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights and Human Rights Council, we have been busy counting occurrences, documenting, reporting, condemning, making recommendations, adopting resolutions, and on occasions freezing aid in the hope of bringing positive change. Just a few days ago, the UN Security Council issued a press statement expressing deep concern, as usual, regarding the closure of girls' high school and calling on the Taliban to respect the right to education. Amnesty International's report, which came out about 8 or 9 days ago, called on the Taliban to immediately stop arbitrary arrests of journalists, civil society activists, former government officials, and those who dissent. Recently, we saw the new UNAMA mandate, which was adopted by UN Security Council. It looks too much human rights oriented, this new mandate, although the mandate looks a little bit reactive rather than preventive as far as the troubles are concerned. We also saw the report of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, which emerged in the form of a resolution of the Human Rights Council on the 3rd of March, which makes a set of recommendations to the de facto authorities and the international community on human rights issues. We've seen at the beginning of this month a joint statement on behalf of 60 countries during the interactive dialogue on the High Commissioner's report on Afghanistan, reaffirming solidarity with Afghan women and girls and calling for their full participation at all levels. The UN report of the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team concerning ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and associated individuals and entities, which was issued in February, says that the return of the Taliban to power has raised concerns globally about the possibility of Afghanistan becoming a safe haven for Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, and a potential magnet for terrorist fighters from other regions to travel to the country. We saw in mid-January a group of 36 Human Rights Council appointed experts. I've had the pleasure of working with some of them, issuing a joint statement. They've expressed that the Taliban attempt to hastily erase women and girls from public life. Of course, about 9 or 10 days after the takeover of the Taliban of Kabul, there was a special session of Human Rights Council, which adopted a resolution strengthening the promotion and protection of human rights in Afghanistan. We just got the news today, by the way, that the World Bank has put some projects in agriculture, education, health, and livelihood in Afghanistan worth $600 million on hold over the Taliban decision to ban girls from returning to high schools. Of course, this creates a dilemma to what extent we could tie aid to human rights issues. Tomorrow, we have the Afghanistan Pledging Conference in Geneva. Let's see what will be the impact of human rights violations on aid. So enough said about the condemnation, the reporting, the information gathering, issue resolution. But how can we make all of this, how can we make these talks work? I'm afraid there are some problems that we, at least from my experience that I've had, that I can see. Number one, the processes are too slow. The 4 stages that we have in the complaints procedure of Human Rights Council takes at least a couple of years for a violation to be addressed. In the end, in the most affirmative response, the Human Rights Council recommends to the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights to provide technical cooperation, capacity building assistance, or advisory services to the state concerned, in this case, Afghanistan. To who? To the Taliban, providing all these technical cooperation. The system that we've been building in the past few decades, counts too much on the functioning states and assumes that they take care of human rights issues and work with the resolutions of the Human Rights Council, General Assembly, and the Security Council. What we have in Afghanistan is a collapsed state in the hands of a group of terrorists who have no constitution, no legitimate government, no parliament, no judiciary, and no independent human rights commission. We call it a country in conflict, and we've got quite a few of them around the world, which is important to look at. They are not functioning states. Every year, there are too many mandates with Human Rights Council and the Third Committee of the General Assembly, and not much time to address them properly. I had, as you said at the beginning, introducing me, I had the pleasure of chairing the Third Committee of the General Assembly. We had a very crowded list of special procedure mandate holders and other experts for presentations, and we only had around 5 weeks to deliberate. And I could easily see that there isn't enough time to really pay attention to them. The other problems that we have is enforcing the UN resolutions. Fair enough, we've had quite a few Security Council resolutions on Afghanistan, and we've got a GA resolution on Afghanistan. But The Human Rights Council resolutions and General Assembly resolutions are not binding. So we've been really issuing resolutions after resolutions, but when you look at them, which country is taking it serious? Countries with systems, yes, they do take them serious, but as far as Afghanistan and the neighboring of Afghanistan is concerned, you can see that there are problems. Security Council resolutions too face major problems. The lack of reform within the Security Council, especially by the veto, doesn't allow effective resolutions with teeth, resolutions that could really work. On the other hand, the implementation of the resolution is highly politicized often and poorly monitored. A good example of that is the sanctions regime on the Taliban and the 1373 resolution on counterterrorism. If only these two, the sanctions regime on the Taliban and the 1373 resolution on counterterrorism, were 50% implemented in the case of Afghanistan, the Taliban wouldn't have been where they are today. Often the UN system hardly deals with the root causes of human rights violations. The system doesn't question why the Taliban are there in the first place. Who radicalized them? Who politicized them? Who militarized them? These conservative religious students, for what motive? Can we stop their violations without addressing the root causes? The answer is, of course, no. During the 28 years of the life of the Taliban, policies of engagement and appeasement are exhausted without bringing any positive result. To what extent we should be reactive and to what extent we should be preventative? These are some of the questions that I wanted to raise. And I wanted to make one point that the real force behind the Taliban and their violation of human rights, where is the real force? According to the Pakistani leaders themselves, the Taliban is a creation of the Inter-Services Intelligence of Pakistan as an instrument of its foreign policy. Now, to us and to everyone else who is familiar with the UN Charter, that is proxy aggression, which should be addressed under Article 41 and 42 of the UN Charter. Let me finally make a few advisory notes, not recommendations. Number one, measure the Taliban by their actions and never, ever by their words or what they sign, as far as agreements are concerned. We saw what happened to the Doha Agreement. Paying attention to humanitarian and human rights issues is our top priority in Afghanistan. In this respect, where possible, engage with the de facto authorities, but please, without appeasement, and make sure they don't take advantage of aid to strengthen their brutal regime. After 28 years of efforts to bring change in the behavior of the Taliban without much luck, the time has come that we all pay more attention to their victims and opponents. They need care, they need resources, and they need coordination. Another point is to bring speed in the work of the international system when it comes to dealing with conflict-affected countries. Don't see them as functioning states. They've got problems. Look at what's happening in Afghanistan, and I'm afraid we don't have the necessary speed within the different organs of the UN and other international institutions. Another point I would like to make that no doubt Afghanistan has internal weaknesses, but the troubles of the past 44 years have been triggered by either direct or proxy foreign invasions, and therefore we need to deal with the root causes rather than the consequences. And finally, fast-tracking reform and updating the UN organs, in particular the Security Council, General Assembly, and Human Rights Council, is the urgent call of the day. Make the UN relevant to the lives of those who need it most. I stop at that. Thank you.